Hello, Melvin.
How you doing?
Just fantastic. How are you?
I'm surviving.
Listen, Melvin, the people want to support the Life of X podcast. How can they support us?
Well, the best way that you can support us is to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a 5-star review. It's also very good to write us a review and let us know how we're doing.
That's right. Additionally, you can head over to lifeofxpodcast.com, visit our support page. There, you will find links to our Patreon page, Audible, where you can go to get a free audiobook, or our Amazon button, which will take you through our portal. And that just means that Amazon will kick us a few cents off of whatever you purchase at no additional charge to you.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Thank you all for your support. We appreciate you. Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Melvin Barnes.
And that makes this the Life of X. All right, Melvin, here we are. Chiang Kai-shek, part 5.
Woo! Who would ever thought we'd get to part 5?
Man, I guess this is what I get for doing this podcast with an East Asianist.
Look, the people need to know. They need the real story.
They do. They do. And hopefully we're able to give it to them in the next couple episodes.
Right.
Before we do, we'd just like to say thank you to everyone who has been leaving us ratings and reviews in iTunes as we continually hammer home on all of our support messages. That is the single best way to get our names out there, help us spread the good word of the Life of X podcast. And we would like to read a couple of those reviews that we have received so far and to say thank you. Melvin, do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, so up first we have EMJ8115. And EMJ says, "Great. This is an awesome conversational show. The hosts break down the research to tell the life stories that I'd never have known. An easy listen for the work commute or road trip." I like that. You know what? Listen to us when you're on your way to work or driving cross country.
Getting swole?
Oh, the gym. Yeah, don't forget the gym. You get definitely 3 extra reps.
You could work out your mind and your muscles. Anyway, next one. We've got very informative 5 stars by E. Sauls 20. E says, "This podcast dives into some of the most well-known names throughout history in a way I have never heard before. Never would have learned about some of the greats without listening to these. If you like a balance of humor while learning, this podcast is a great listen." And you know what? I couldn't agree more. But I'd also like to point out that we plan on also diving into some lesser-known names.
Oh, yeah. We've got some lesser-known figures coming up.
That's right. Melvin, would you like to give the people a quick recap of what we talked about in Chiang Kai-shek, part 4?
So part 4. Now, the Allies are the Allies. China's working along with the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain to defeat the axis of evil. Japan, Italy, and Germany. Germany has invaded the Soviet Union, and China is now no longer by themselves, although they're fairly isolated because the Burma Road has been severed. General Stilwell has arrived on the scene.
And then he left.
Right, and then he left for India. So now we're going to get into the fighting alongside the Allies.
All right. We're going to start off with the famous or infamous Doolittle raids.
So what were the Doolittle raids? Basically, the United States needed a propaganda victory after, all the losses that, the United States and Great Britain have suffered at the hands of the Japanese following Pearl Harbor. Well, they say, hey, we're going to send out a secret mission and bomb Tokyo. And this is obviously going to be a major symbolic sort of victory for the U.S. and the Allies because it's going to show like, hey, we can touch you whenever we want. But unfortunately, the bases weren't in place for us to actually do this in a sound manner. So the idea was that they are going to fly these bombers over from carriers in the Pacific over Japan, but they're not going to have enough fuel to make it back. So what they actually have to do is crash land in China.
Okay.
This is the American plan.
Nothing can go wrong.
And Chiang Kai-shek, for most of the planning, has no idea that this is going to be going on. I believe the United States gave Chiang Kai-shek 1 week's notice that this was going to happen.
I mean, he didn't really need to know, right?
Oh, yeah, he knew. So he pleads with them to delay the raids. But the Americans are like, listen, you need to get behind this because this is happening. And he knows that this is going to be bad for China because these planes are going to crash land in eastern China, which parts of it are under Japanese occupation, but they're hoping to land in the parts that are under Chinese control. And to sweeten the pot, to sort of make Chiang less worried, the U.S. says, hey, look, you can keep the planes when they land. You can take them into your Air Force.
You can have these crash-landed planes that may or may not land on your side of the border.
Funny you say crash-landed, because none of these planes were usable after that. And he was also worried that they had some air bases, right, that Chenault was using in eastern China, but he was worried that once this attack happened, the Japanese would attack these bases and they would no longer be operational. And that's exactly what happened. So after the Doolittle raids, which successfully bombed Tokyo, many of the planes landed in China. And as, Chiang had worried, the Japanese retaliated with unbelievable force.
Don't poke the bear.
And he ends up, explaining to the Americans, he says, listen, the Japanese slaughtered every man, woman, and child in the area. The Japanese response was swift and it was horrible. And actually, the Chinese did a lot to protect these pilots. Many of these pilots were protected and able to sort of get out of there thanks to the help that Chinese on the ground provided for these pilots. But the cost was absolutely enormous, and Chenault ends up losing his airfields, a lot of them in eastern China.
And important to note that this was pretty much just a symbolic victory. So it wasn't like lives were lost for a great strategic gain.
Right. This was a propaganda win.
That cost many
Chinese lives.
Innocent lives.
Which
non-combatant lives.
The United States was willing to sacrifice.
Yeah.
But, that's the nature of this war at this point in time. Chiang, he's butting heads with Stilwell throughout all of this. And he's actually been thinking about having Stilwell recalled. But he ultimately chooses not to because he thinks that, there would be a loss of face for the Americans. And he doesn't want them to do that. He's really invested in maintaining this relationship as best he can.
And my understanding of it, too, is that his wife, Sung Mei-ling, had a lot to do with that, too. She was, by this point, pretty much his most trusted advisor.
Yeah, and you have to remember also that, she'd gone to college in the U.S., so, she had these
She had connections.
She had connections, and when it came to things on the United States, I'm sure he trusted her advice.
And I think they both recognized the importance of having America as an ally for the remainder of this conflict.
But unfortunately for his regime, his alliance with the United States was very, very tough. There was this idea that started to sort of circulate in the American circles was that, Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT was not willing to engage the enemy, that they didn't want to fight, which Taylor takes the time to point out that this is kind of odd because Chiang lost 80,000 men between December, so around Pearl Harbor of 1941, and July of 1942. The U.S. losses in that time had only amounted to about 33,000. So, the Chinese were active, but they may not have been active in the ways that the United States would have liked. And throughout all of this time, as we mentioned in the last episode, Stilwell ran out of Burma, a massive defeat, but he immediately starts planning how they're going to retake Burma. And he devises a plan that's remarkably similar to a plan that Chiang had proposed. They were going to use two forces, the X and the Y force. And the X force were Chinese soldiers that were trained in India. So basically the survivors from the retreat they had. So they were going to be rearmed, re-equipped, and sent back into Burma. And the Y force were troops that were stationed in Yunnan, which is a southwestern province of China below Sichuan. So they were going to have a sort of two-pronged attack, and that's what Stilwell was planning for, and Chiang was giving him the space to plan for this. And meanwhile, in 1942, Chiang's relationship with President Roosevelt was actually getting better. It was pretty good. So to digress for a moment, China had obviously had some issues with a lot of the European countries in the United States. So there's this thing that we call extraterritoriality. So basically what it meant was these foreigners, British, Americans, French, whatever, when they were in China, they had this right to extraterritoriality, which means that they were not subject to Chinese laws. So basically, if they broke the law, they would have to be turned over to, let's say, the British police, the American police, whatever, in China. So they wouldn't be tried under Chinese systems. And as you can imagine, this was a really big issue for people in China. So you could have a British person murder a Chinese person, and they would not be held responsible by the Chinese courts.
Yeah, you had to trust that the British courts would hold him responsible.
Right, and a lot of times they didn't.
Shocking.
So, one thing that Chiang was able to negotiate with the Americans was the abolition of extraterritoriality, between the two countries in October of 1942. So now Americans, if they broke the law, in theory, were supposed to have to listen to Chinese laws, and if they broke Chinese laws, they would be tried in China in their court system. And he also agreed to deliver additional aircraft by 1943.
And that's something I want to touch on real quick, because I think it's implied by what we talked about and how we talked about in the last episode that China was included in the Lend-Lease bill. But a lot of what came with being allied to the Americans was receiving military aid, like in the form of materiel. And this also sort of touches on what Melvin had mentioned about people sort of accusing Chiang and the KMT of not being as active in the fight. Taylor kind of goes to lengths to not only point out that he was in fact active in the fight, but a lot of the criticisms that he was facing, that he wasn't fighting as much as he could have been, and that he was hoarding the material that the United States was sending in preparation for a fight with the CCP, wasn't actually true, but was exactly what Mao and the CCP was doing.
Yeah, so, one thing, like, the Americans in the U.S. are thinking, we're sending you all of this stuff. You had better be fighting. And in their minds, Chiang wasn't fighting. And one thing that Taylor points out is, look, the Americans are supplying the Chinese forces, but they're not sending everything that they promised. There's not as much being supplied as many people have been led to believe. And in fact, a lot of those materials end up sort of in Stilwell's hands, and he kind of becomes in charge of doling it out, even though Chiang is the Supreme Allied Commander in China. So he's
effectively having to appeal to his chief of staff,
right, to
say, "Hey, I need that." And Stilwell, who at this point pretty much holds the ultimate power, because
he has his own plans,
right?
They're fighting over this material, what little material that they're getting, and in fact, most of the material is usually prioritized for the fights in Europe. So not as much material is rolling in as maybe a lot of people would have thought, but it's certainly they're getting something. Bullets, gasoline. This is all being supplied to the best of the American abilities, given the situation, the wartime situation.
Right. And then that kind of brings us up on our timeline to the Cairo Conference, which began November 21st, 1943.
So at this conference, they debated the invasion of Burma. And the British had a lot of disagreements with Chiang's approach to the fighting in Burma. Going back to our discussion that we had in the last episode about Chiang Kai-shek visiting India and talking about anti-colonialism, this naturally was not, was difficult for the British, because in the British mind, after the war, things would go back to how they were before. You would have these British colonies, and colonialism would continue to exist. The British would still maintain colonies in Asia, Africa, and around the world. But Chiang Kai-shek and increasingly Franklin Roosevelt did not believe that that would be the case. So Burma being a British colony, they had some issues in figuring out how they were going to move forward on the fighting there. And the Chinese and the British really had some disagreements.
Yeah, and I just want to point out too that the Cairo Conference was a big deal for Chiang, because here he is on a global stage with these world leaders.
Yeah.
And so it really elevated his status. So not only was he there as someone who is anti-colonialist, but now people are seeing that this Chinese man who is not only pushing for anti-colonialism, he's here on the same level as Churchill, as FDR. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was a big moment for him on the world stage.
Yeah, you have to remember, man, China had been sort of facing European, American, whatever aggression since, the 1840s, man. It's been literally 100 years since China had seen itself on equal footing with Europeans, the Americans. So this is a major moment, man. This is a huge photo op. Chiang sees this as, this is huge.
Yeah. And, when he ends up leaving the Cairo conference, he feels euphoric, is how Taylor describes it. But
he made one mistake.
He makes a big mistake. And I cannot understand what he was thinking. Because by this point, his relationship with Stilwell is not good.
It's real bad.
Yeah. But he decides that he's going to leave Stilwell to represent his interests at Cairo.
Yeah. So he talked about most of what he wanted to talk about, but he's on his way out. So he's like, hey, I'm going to head back to China. Stilwell, wrap all this up for me. And what Stilwell does is basically the opposite of what he wanted. Stilwell argues for a reversal of a lot of what Chiang had argued for. He had said, yeah, Chiang changed his mind. He doesn't want to do that anymore. He doesn't want to do this route in the battle for Burma. And obviously, naturally, the Allies are like, what? Like, we're upset. Like, we agreed to all this stuff, and now you're saying that he's changed his mind? This doesn't make sense. Needless to say, leaving Stilwell in charge.
Big misstep.
Big misstep because it did damage his reputation amongst the Allied leaders. But on December 1st, there were some good things that came out of the conference. They signed an agreement that following the defeat of Japan, that Japan would return all territory to China. This included Manchuria and the island of Taiwan, which China lost to Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895.
So Chiang leaves Stilwell in Cairo to misrepresent his interests, and he heads on back to Chongqing, where more happiness awaits.
Yeah, so he gets back to Chongqing to realize there's some people trying to kidnap me again. There was this plot by 3 young generals. They were going to kidnap Chiang once he got back from Cairo, which, Chiang was thinking was the high point of his career to that moment. But luckily for him, Dai Li, who we mentioned, I believe, in episode 2, who's Chiang Kai-shek's sort of dirty doer. When you need somebody disappeared, Dai Li was the guy to handle it. He executes or imprisons the 3 generals and the rest of the people that are involved in the plot, but Dai Li was the one that caught the plot. So as good as things were going in Cairo, he comes back and he's like, geez, man, got to come back to this. People trying to kidnap me and kill me. And speaking of killing him, for whatever reason, Stilwell has this he's working out a plan to to assassinate Chiang Kai-shek.
He's like, listen, I'm not saying I'm going to kill him, but
we need to have this lined up just in case.
Just in case we need to.
Right. And it may have, at some point in time come across in U.S. interest where they're like, we just need to get rid of Chiang Kai-shek.
Yeah.
Stilwell directs these guys to come up with a plan, and the plan that they come up with is laughable.
It's like a cartoon.
Yeah. They were like, okay, so we'll get him in a plane.
And then something will go wrong with the plane.
We'll fake some engine trouble, and we'll give him a faulty parachute. Yeah, that's how we'll get rid of the commander of China.
It's actually cartoonish.
Yeah. So Stilwell wisely never talks about this again.
He's like, all right, guys, that was a bad idea. We're moving on.
But Chiang's victories at the Cairo Conference were short-lived. So one of the reasons why they had the Cairo Conference, which was Churchill, Roosevelt, and Chiang. Stalin was not there. I can't remember if we said that he was there, but he was not there.
I don't think we said he was.
Stalin and Chiang were not ready to be in the same room with each other because they had some serious disagreements.
Had some beef.
Because obviously, Chiang has problems with the CCP. Stalin does not.
Who's backing the CCP? Uncle Joe.
Right. So there was a second conference that was scheduled following that called the Tehran Conference, which was Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, basically everybody but Chiang. On that day, or at that conference, the Allies hammer out and agree to the massive invasion of Europe, which obviously becomes D-Day. And they had already earlier talked about this invasion that they were going to have of Burma that was going to use all these landing craft and things like that. Well, now that's not happening because they need all of the materials, all of the landing crafts, everything they can get for this massive invasion of Normandy, which will, in fairness, be the largest amphibious assault in human history. So Chiang, once he finds out about this, is like, okay, I figured you guys would kind of change the plans. That's fine. But he tries to guilt the United States into giving him some more supplies. And he was playing this card of saying, listen, China is constantly under threat of collapse. He's like, listen, man, we're barely making it. And if you guys don't give us this stuff, can't guarantee that China's going to remain in the fight. And, obviously this was important because China was tying down over 1 million Japanese soldiers.
I don't know at this point if this is the correct number, but I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that Taylor says that at one point China was responsible for holding down something like 2/3 of the Japanese force.
Oh, yeah. Well, you think about it this way. The United States, in its fighting with Japan, was fighting a lot of island battles.
Right.
You've got Iwo Jima, things like that. You can't fit that many people on those islands, you know? So we're fighting a relatively small portion of the Japanese armed forces. I mean, a lot of it's, obviously, we've got the bulk of the Japanese Navy. But in terms of men facing men on the ground, China is where it's at, where it's happening. So it's important to us to keep China in the war, if not for anything else. Is like, we don't want to fight these other 1.5 million guys that China has locked down.
Right.
So he threatens that, like, we might collapse soon, which wasn't a wholly just pulling it out of the air. I mean, there were worries that there could be some sort of assault on Chongqing. And if that happened, there was no guarantee that China was going to make it out. And they were obviously barely had the supplies to keep themselves in the war, but they were hanging on by the skin of their teeth. But this sort of threat played into Stilwell's hand, right? Yeah. Stilwell's kind of saying, like, listen, they're not really fighting. All they want to do is get all of this material that they can from the United States so they can eventually fight the communists. And it kind of looks like that's what Chiang is doing. He's just asking for more and more stuff, and he's not really doing anything. So this wasn't, a good moment for Chiang Kai-shek.
But it was a great moment for Stilwell, who had been pushing for that resurgent Burma campaign.
Yeah, and that, without the aid of the amphibious landing and a lot of the Allied Navy, the attack on Burma goes on.
Can you imagine the conversation that Stilwell was probably having? He was like, listen, guys, I know last time, we were in the jungle and then suddenly I was gone. I had a heroic escape, but I'm ready to go back.
Right, and them saying, like, remember that time when you failed?
And then you left your troops that you were supposed to be commanding in the jungle?
We're going to give you a mulligan. And I can't even imagine being one of the soldiers. I'd be like, guys.
This guy again?
I'm not going back. I'd be like, I'm going to stay here in India. I found a nice home. Like, I'm staying here. But, these guys go back in, and there's a lot of fighting over the strategy. Stilwell wants a sort of grander attack on Burma where they take everything. Some guys want the fight to be focused on North Burma. There was a lot of disagreement, and things don't initially go all that well. What ends up happening is in March, the fighting takes a real bad turn for the worst. 3 Japanese divisions carrying only 1 month's supply of rice surrounded 60,000 British troops. And Roosevelt tells Chiang to send the Y Force, but Chiang holds out for more supplies, and also because he's worried about an impending Japanese assault in China. And they had confirmed this assault because they could see the troop transfers by train coming down from Manchuria down into the rest of China.
That's a tough position to be in for Chiang Kai-shek. You've got Roosevelt who's like, hey, I'm going to need you to send this force. And he's like, hey, I don't have the troops or the supplies. And also, remember last time when we poked the bear? Remember what happened then?
Yeah.
I can see them. I can see the bear.
He's like, the bear's doing something. It's waking up. And, Chiang tries to get some more supplies, and this does not go particularly well. Obviously, Roosevelt is like, man, if you don't send these troops, I'm cutting everything off. You need to make sure you get in this fight. Now, unfortunately for China, Chiang in his intelligence was correct. This is when Japan launches what's called the Ichigo campaign in April of 1944. This goes from April until December, and it's an absolutely massive assault. In fact, I think it's the largest assault that the Japanese will mount in the entire war. They move 150,000 Manchurian troops down to southern China, and this involved 500,000 frontline troops. I want to repeat, 500,000 frontline troops, hundreds of tanks. And the reason for the campaign was that the Americans had destroyed a lot of Japan's merchant fleet. So Japan was having a hard time moving materials from its colonies, from the greater expanses of the Japanese Empire, back to Japan or into Manchuria, where they can produce weapons, tanks, all these things. So normally they would, say, transport oil from the oil fields of South Asia to Manchuria, because the island of Japan doesn't have a lot of natural resources in the way of oil, minerals, things like that, so they have to get it elsewhere.
Right. If you can't produce it yourself, you got to go take it.
Exactly. And they had established those colonies, but now they were running into problems shipping it back to where they needed it. So what they were trying to do was open up a land route. So they were trying to get a land route from South Asia up through China, up into Manchuria, the head of the chicken, which from there they could transport it across the Strait of Tsushima, which is the narrow passage between Korea and Japan, and then they could produce weapons and things like that, and they could not worry so much about the Allied navies destroying all of this stuff as it was transported. So that was the Japanese thinking, and it was the largest Japanese offensive of the war. Now, we have to remember that the Chinese were facing this with no armor, no motor pool. They had some old cannons, probably a lot from World War I, and for every 3 soldiers, there were only 2 rifles.
Man.
That is bad.
That's so bad.
That's real bad. Like, I want no part of that fighting.
Nope.
And the fact that they're actually going to try to stand up to this is hats off to them. I mean, these got to be some of the bravest guys.
Too bad they weren't doing anything.
Yeah, God. So basically what ends up happening is you have this offensive that launches kind of out of that sort of Shanghai, Wuhan area. And then you have another offensive that's marching down from northern China. And what falls first is Henan province, which is south of Beijing. It would fall, and a second assault would be launched into Hunan province, which is well below the chain. It's in Changsha and Henyang. Changsha and Henyang, 2 major cities in Hunan, would both fall relatively quickly. So while this is going on, the Allies were successful in winning a decisive battle in Burma, though.
Look at Vinegar Joe.
I know.
Out here.
I think actually the British did.
No.
We'll give it to Vinegar.
We're giving it to Vinegar Joe.
Okay. Oddly enough, a lot of this fighting took place in northeast India, which is strange because, well, the decisive battle took place in northeast India, which I didn't even realize up until I reread this point that there was even any fighting in India. So 120 of Japan's best troops were repulsed, and the Japanese Imperial Army suffered, or it could have been the Navy, but I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure it's the Army, suffered 55,000 casualties with 13,500 killed. So this was a major victory for the Allies in Burma.
But in China, things are not going great.
Yeah, so the war, obviously, with this massive Japanese offensive is pretty precarious. And there's a lot of rumors that are swirling around Chiang Kai-shek in Chongqing. There's rumors, one, that Chiang was cheating on Mei Ling. Whether or not this is true, I have no idea. There was reports that Mei Ling found a shoe in the bedroom that didn't belong to her, like a high heel. She supposedly chucked it out the window and smoked one of the guards in the head. I hope that part of the story is true. And I hope she just forgot that it was like, oh, I do own this shoe.
Whoops, this was actually my shoe. I apologize.
Right. But she's so upset. And for, I guess, some reasons that are unknown to us, she leaves China and heads to Brazil, of all places, before returning to the U.S., where she's readmitted at the Presbyterian Hospital. So previously, when she visited the U.S., she had stayed at this hospital where she takes over an entire floor of the Harkness Pavilion. So she's out of the country because she's upset. And
that's got to be a big loss to him because she was
that rock.
She was, and big time confidant, advisor, not to mention major connection to the United States.
But they're still together. And the nice thing is she can still do work on his behalf. Just now she's closer to the Americans. But what was really bad was a lot of Americans are now thinking that maybe, Chiang's regime is just, it's not good. We can't really rely on them. So we need to find other options in China.
Maybe instead of one China, we could have 2 Chinas.
Yeah, or at least at the very, at least at the point here, they're thinking about talking to the communists.
Right.
They're like, we can talk to the communists and see, because, where we think the KMT isn't willing to fight, those communists, we think they're ready to go. The wild thing is again, like we talked about earlier, imagine Americans that are choosing to say, hey, maybe we need to put our faith in communists. It's just amazing to think about because a few years later, we're going to be so rabidly anti-communist, like the worst thing you could say about someone was like, you're a commie.
Yeah. No, like actually it would ruin someone's life. Yeah.
Like if they even, real or not, like someone saying you're a communist, it's like, oh no, well, you can't work here, son.
Yeah.
So there's that. But then, gosh, to make things even worse, Roosevelt now starts to call for Stilwell to be promoted to basically the head of the command in China. Basically, he wanted Stilwell to direct and call the shots for all the troops. He was supposed to be beholden to Chiang, but realistically, this would have made Stilwell the most powerful man in China. And they wanted to, offer him command of the Chinese armies, including the communist forces, which I would have loved to have seen them actually make that work out.
Yeah.
But Chiang really, he wants Stilwell removed, more than anything.
And there's a guy we haven't talked about yet, Lachlan Curry, and we don't really need to go in depth about who he is, but he was more or less Taylor refers to him as an agent of influence. And he was just there on behalf of the United States, kind of working as a middleman. And Chiang had made it known to him previously that he wanted Stilwell gone. And it's just like over and over again. He's like, no, like we have to, keep our relationship good with the United States by being conciliatory. And Stilwell, I know, thorn in your side, but
yeah, that was a major mistake.
Yeah.
And, the letters that Chiang exchanged with Roosevelt regarding Stilwell and this whole issue of working with the communist became increasingly caustic. Like, it just became worse and worse. It seems like Roosevelt's patience was waning. And, to make matters worse, Stilwell, expecting this promotion, starts to sort of hold up the Lend-Lease material. He's like, no, I'm not going to give you this stuff until we make a decision regarding my role in China. And in fact, there was an offensive that Chiang was carrying out along with Chennault, and Stilwell, in the midst of this sort of offensive, is like, they run out of aviation fuel, and they need it to help this offensive keep going. And Stilwell refuses to release the aviation fuel, which, for me, regardless of what's going on politically between you and Chiang, the thing that really didn't sit well with me was the fact that these are Chinese lives, right, that are being lost, and it's like, sure, this is some sort of political game, but you've got to realize that, because these guys don't have the aviation fuel, more soldiers are going to die.
Yeah.
So that shows how bad the situation had got between them. And the United States, again, to make matters even worse for Chiang, sends out this, what they call the Dixie Mission, which was a group of Americans that were sent to Yan'an, which is the communist capital, to sort of see what's going on there. And one thing that the communists are able to do is really put their best foot forward for the Americans.
Right.
And these Americans take
it up.
Hook, line, and sinker. They're like, man, I don't see any problems with the communists. Like, everything there seems to be good. And it's like if you go to someone's house, you clean up before you have people over, and they walk in and like, man, your house is clean. Like, they live like this. And then when they leave, it's like, okay, we can go back to normal, knock over a bookshelf, throw my clothes everywhere. So, the communists were doing whatever they could to sort of fan these sort of feelings.
And that seems to be like a hallmark of the Chinese communists at this point, that, Mao and Zhou Enlai just seem to outmaneuver.
They're playing chess, man.
Everyone.
And the thing is that the Americans have this idea that we can draw the communists away from working with the Soviets, working with Stalin. And it's like, realistically,
I mean, hindsight is 20/20, but I have a hard time getting there.
Yeah, I mean, it was, you got to think, like, the Chinese communists were, like, mythical, man. Like, you couldn't easily contact them and things like that. Like, you had to go to this lowly Yan'an where you could make contact with the communist rebels. So they had this mystique about them, and the Americans really bought into that mystique. And Chiang was obviously naturally worried about that. Because some people would recommend, like, hey, we need to arm these communists and stop arming Chiang Kai-shek. So, besieged on all sides, Chiang Kai-shek starts to draw up the plans to have Joseph Stilwell become pretty much the commander of the fighting in China.
That's a rough position to be in.
Man, that's a tough pill to swallow for Chiang.
Yeah. Given
how bad his relationship had been with Stilwell.
Right. But it was really like the only choice he had.
Yeah, he was backed against the wall. I mean, the Japanese, the offensive, the fighting in China was going bad, and it just looked like his regime was so corrupt and ineffective that they had to do something.
Yeah.
To shake things up. But things get dramatically worse, whereas the Allied leaders are having a conference in Quebec, and they receive word from Stilwell that Chiang is planning to remove the X-Force from Burma. Now, remember, the British had won a really important victory there, but there's still fighting going on. And what had actually happened was Chiang had asked that the X-Force would attack this place called Longling, but Stilwell thought that they were too tired to move. And Chiang said if they're too tired to fight, I'll pull them back to Kunming, which is in China. Stilwell then sends a report to Quebec saying Chiang planned on retreating from Burma. And naturally, Roosevelt hits the ceiling. He's like, all that we've been doing in this area, what is he thinking? Now, based on Taylor's research, this is a misrepresentation of what Chiang had actually said. Given the full details, maybe Roosevelt would have taken a different response.
But that wouldn't have been in Stilwell's interest.
Exactly. So what happens now is Stilwell gets a reply from Roosevelt, and it is real bad. In fact, Stilwell gets this reply, and he's giddy. He's like, I'm taking this directly to Chiang myself.
And I'm going to read it to him.
Right. But on the way, Hurley finds out about this report, and he reads it, and he's like, bruh, you cannot give this to Chiang. Like, under no circumstances can you give this to Chiang. And Hurley had just been working with Chiang on writing up the details.
Remind us who Hurley was again?
So Patrick J. Hurley was President Roosevelt's special envoy to China. I'd say he's the guy who's trying to make things work.
And he's an interesting character.
Yeah, he was born in the 1883 on the Choctaw Reservation.
Yeah.
So he was very proud of his ties to Native Americans.
Yeah, and I believe he was like politically active in Oklahoma or something like that prior to his rise in the army. I believe he was like a brigadier general.
Yeah.
Or something like that, but it's funny because he sticks out in Taylor's biography because they talk about when he landed in China.
This was in Yan'an, in the communist
okay. So when
territory.
he lands in Yan'an, he kicks his head back and just lets out a Choctaw war cry.
Yeah.
But anyway.
So he runs into this guy, and Hurley reads the letter, and he's like, my God, you cannot give this to Chiang. It's way too bad. So in an attempt to soften it, because Stilwell refuses to not give it to him, and Hurley explains to him, he's like, Joe, we've been working on your promotion all day. You've won the game, man. If you just don't give this to him, you can get the position that you want.
Just don't rub his face in it, and you win.
Stilwell couldn't resist. He had to see Chiang eat crow.
Yeah.
And the thing that was so bad was that he convinces them to not use the English version of the letter, and they use the Chinese version of the letter because they thought that it was less caustic.
Hectoring.
And it turns out it was even worse than the English version. So Chiang gets this message. Now they come in, they're enjoying some tea. So he reads the message, and Chiang immediately turns over his cup and like pushes it away from him, which is a sign that's like, this meeting is over. And Stilwell standing there goes, so I take it, this meeting is over? And one of the servants or servers was like, yeah, it's time for you to go. So they leave the room, and Chiang, who I believe is only there with his brother, I think it's TV Sung, just starts crying. Like, he just breaks down. Because this is the most sort of humiliating thing that he's had to deal with, probably in his life.
Yeah.
Or at least he says it was.
Yeah. This was a giant slap in the face. And, like we had touched on before, Stilwell had won the game.
Yeah.
If he had just bit his tongue, it would have been done. But at this point, Chiang was like, I don't care what happens. I'm not losing to him. It's not happening.
Yeah.
So he absolutely refuses to turn over any authority to Joseph Stilwell. And then, to make matters worse, if he wasn't already in a terrible situation, he receives word that the United States wants to go hang out in Yan'an again.
Yeah, because they believe that they can reduce the CCP's dependency on the Russians. Crazy.
Again, hindsight, 2020. But it's so hard for me to get there mentally. Like, what were you thinking?
Yeah, man. I don't know. I mean, based on Taylor's account, a lot of times we talk about the Chinese communists making the decision to lean towards one side, this side being Russia at a later date. But according to Taylor's account, they've been leaning towards the Russians this whole time, so there's no need to...
They've been laying on the Russians.
Right. Now, on February 9th, 1945, Roosevelt makes a request to have another sort of trip to Yan'an. Not him, but American representatives. And Chiang laments in his diary. He says, it's bad enough young and naive American military officers in China believe the CCP's propaganda. Even worse, senior officials do too. So Chiang has his hands tied and just says, okay, whatever, do whatever you want. But the Americans were going to send people anyway.
And that kind of leads us into the Yalta Conference. And,
right.
Prior to this, there had been talks about a full allied leader conference, which would have included Chiang. But by the time what would become Yalta rolls around, the U.S. and the Allies feel like they're in pretty good shape, and they don't want to step on Uncle Joe's toes. And having Chiang Kai-shek there might have done so.
Right. So this Yalta Conference, for people who like to talk about World War II, this is one of the big ones, man. This is where the Allies start to discuss what the post-war world is going to look like.
The New World Order.
Yeah, this is where all the big deals are going to get hashed out. So the United States begins to negotiate with Russia, and they have a number of secret accords regarding China. I can't imagine why Chiang Kai-shek would be upset about this.
Me either.
They're making decisions that directly impact his country, one of the big four, without actually talking to Chiang Kai-shek. Naturally, this enrages Chiang. He's very upset. Basically, there's a lot of things that Roosevelt promises Stalin that's just, in the Chinese eyes, it's not okay.
And, from my reading of Taylor, it seems like, or at least Taylor portrays it as, that FDR's objective at Yalta was sort of appeasing Stalin first. And he was like, if I have to make these promises that will upset Chiang, I can straighten it out later.
Yeah. So one of the big objectives was to secure Russia's, the Soviets' agreement to enter the Asian conflict. So he needed them to enter the fight against Japan. And he had to make some concessions to do that. Part of it was that they agreed that, the Soviets would be able to control some assets in Manchuria. Again, we're talking about like the railway. So there's a lot of important stuff in Manchuria that Roosevelt promises Stalin. And this sort of steps on China's rights, as a sovereign nation. But in the end, they secure Stalin's agreement that his armies will enter the war against Japan within 90 days, I believe, of the defeat of the Germans, which is quickly coming down the pipe. Now, Stalin at this point in time tells Mao to prepare for the Soviet invasion. And Mao begins, this sort of anti-Chiang and anti-U.S. propaganda campaign and he tells Zhou Enlai, man, it's time to begin preparing for the conflict against the KMT. So knowing that the war will be over soon, you really start to see the posturing by the CCP and also eventually the KMT for the coming conflict that might break out after the war.
Now, according to Taylor, while all this was happening, even though Chiang Kai-shek kind of gets screwed at Yalta, FDR still was in favor of Chiang leading China.
Yeah. I mean, he was upset with Chiang, but he was probably still one of Chiang's biggest supporters.
Right. Problem for Chiang was that he died April 12th, 1945.
Yeah, so not long after Yalta.
Right. And Truman, who was his replacement, was all about reaffirming the Yalta Agreement.
Yeah, so Roosevelt had started to have some reservations about the Yalta Agreement as he saw sort of the Soviets flexing their muscles and saying, okay, this is what they think the post-war world is going to look like. I don't know. So Roosevelt was having some reservations. But Truman was like, when he came to power after Roosevelt passed, he's like, oh yeah, we're going to stick with everything that we agreed to at Yalta.
Truman was like, I never think I was going to have to make any of these decisions. So we'll just go with what happened at Yalta.
Let's ride with it. In addition to Roosevelt's death in April, there's another significant death in April.
Or escape to South America. Or the moon.
Dum, dum, dum.
Dun, dum.
So Hitler dies, or shall we say commits suicide, on April 30th, 1945. The writing's on the wall. Germany will be out of the war shortly after Hitler commits suicide. And this means help is on the way. So the Russians will invade Manchuria on August 7th, 1945. And this brings us into the eventual collapse of the Japanese Empire. Chiang was, well, we'll put it this way. There's a lot of debate around what forced the Japanese to surrender, and we may be getting outside of our discussion here. But in addition to the invasion of Manchuria, the Americans also dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, and this was on August 6th and August 9th, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these are obviously devastating weapons that leveled large portions of the city in a moment.
So, real quick timeline here. You have August 6th, 1 atomic bomb.
Boom.
August 7th, 750,000 Russians invade Manchuria.
Boom.
August 9th, another atomic bomb.
Yeah. So you have to think about this too. We had the Ichigo campaign earlier where you had 150,000 of Japan's best troops move from Manchuria down into China.
Mm-hmm.
So what's left is a lot of puppet troops, a lot of less well-trained troops that are in Manchuria. The Russian forces cut through these guys that are in Manchuria like a hot knife through butter. I mean, basically as fast as the tanks could drive, that's how fast they're riding through Manchuria. They took the whole thing in like 7 days.
Yeah. And so not only does this is a huge hit to the Japanese, it's also a boon to the CCP because as it turns out, as the Russians storm through Manchuria, as they recover materiel from the Japanese, they're handing it over to the CCP.
Right. This will happen after the surrender. But the Russians have taken all of Manchuria. The Japanese are faced with a tough decision because they've got atomic bombs exploding and they've lost their industrial base in Manchuria because they built a lot of their weapons of war in Manchuria. So when that was gone, they were left with a tough decision. And, you know, by this point in time, the United States had leveled 68 or 70 of Japan's largest cities. There was barely a city left that was standing in Japan. So they're looking at this and they're saying, okay, we've got 2 bombs that exploded that leveled an entire city, 2 cities. The Soviets have invaded Manchuria and taken that from us. And this is probably one of the few points where Hirohito really puts his foot down because they're having a debate. A lot of the Army and Navy members in the Japanese armed forces believe we're going to continue to fight. They're preparing for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, and it's going to be bloody. It's going to be real bad. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Americans are going to lose their lives, and the same thing goes for the Japanese. But Hirohito decides that we're going to surrender. I believe there was a discussion that was had where one of them said, can we face the Americans when they land? Some of the military leaders said yes. And then they asked, can we face the Soviets? And they said no. At that point, there was the real realization that they can't win.
Which must have been sobering from the Japanese perspective to have been dominant for how long? By this point, like 100 years.
They've been doing work since, late 19th century, early 20th century. They'd been working out since then, man. They beat the Chinese, the Russians. They did a number on the Americans and the British. But, some people like to choose between the atomic bombs or the invasion of Manchuria. They're like, which one was more important? I think you have to look at the holistic picture.
Yeah.
You say, faced with these realities, they said, can't do it. Hirohito told his generals, this is it. The war is over. The Japanese would eventually surrender in August of 1945, and Chiang was having a banquet with a new Mexican ambassador, which blows my mind because I'm trying to figure out what ambassador's like, yeah, I'm going to go to China right now.
I'm going to go to war-torn China.
They're on the verge of collapse, but I'm on my way. And that's when he learns of the Japanese surrender. I think he heard some fireworks going off across the street, and he's like, someone runs in and tells him, war's over. But as Arif already alluded to, this touches off a race for Manchuria.
This is crazy, too, to think about from Chiang's perspective, because obviously he'd been fighting the Japanese for so long. So it must have, on one hand, must have felt so good to hear that they had surrendered.
He's probably like, I told you we'd make it.
But he also had to know pretty much immediately.
Something else is cooking.
Right. Well, now I got the communists again.
Yeah. And they're in a much better position than when I left them. So now there's this scramble for Manchuria. Now you have to remember the Soviets are in Manchuria. They've captured it. And there's all of this industrial equipment and weapons and things like that the Japanese had there. Now, what the Russians do is obviously like, okay, we're going to take care of ourselves first. We're going to take all of the real cool equipment and good stuff that the Japanese left, and we're going to take it back to Russia.
Yeah.
So they busted down most of the factories and took anything that was important back to Russia. Because you have to remember, the Soviets had been fighting the Germans, and the Germans had made it almost to Moscow.
Yeah, no, we cannot overstate the devastation that the Russians had faced during this war.
So they needed to rebuild a lot of their industries. And, they took that captured equipment and took it back. And they left some for the Chinese communists. So the Chinese communists start to move into Manchuria. And Chiang, who's most of his forces are in the south, are like, man, we need to get back up there. But they can't really get up there. There's no really good roads. Train lines have been destroyed. I mean, China has been at war by this point in time for like 20, 30 years. The infrastructure is just not there. So they need American help to get back throughout China. And they issue an order to the Japanese. They say, listen, you don't surrender to anyone that's not KMT forces. So the U.S. agrees to airlift and boat Chiang's forces back into Manchuria. And that starts this mad scramble. Now, Stalin sort of puts the brakes on this a little bit, and he says, hey, CCP, slow down, because at this point in time, we don't want to antagonize the U.S. because they got a big bomb. We don't have it yet. So, again, Stalin is occupying Manchuria, but he's also gutting all of the equipment out of there. And this is where the CCP and the KMT begin sort of peace talks, because they want to negotiate a sort of political end to the Civil War and see if they can create like a unified China in the wake of this war. But the real question is, are either of these parties negotiating in good faith?
And I don't think the answer was yes.
Right. I think they're waiting to fight. They've been like, listen, this fight started in 1927. We're going to finish it. So, again, the Americans send their guys to try to work out a negotiation between the CCP and the KMT. The talks produce an agreement that they're going to work together to form a democratic China, but there's no firm details, and we all know the devil's in the details. The fact that they weren't able to form any real agreements is a sign that things aren't going to go well.
Yeah, they weren't all that serious.
Yeah, and I think the British once said that the American policy in China was based on an illusion. And it was basically this idea that Chiang and the KMT could come together with the Chinese communists and somehow put aside their differences and work for a united China.
I just wonder, how do you even think that would work? What mental gymnastics would you have to do to think that that would ever be the case?
Who knows, man? But while all of this talking is going on, behind the scenes, Chiang's forces and Mao's forces are moving into place for the Civil War. The CCP is told eventually to deploy 500,000 troops into Manchuria. And the Soviets, while this is happening, are blocking the KMT from redeploying their troops. So what they would do is Stalin and the Soviets would say, hey, we'll be out next week. Just hold your horses.
Yeah.
And then, no, we'll be out a little later. And all the while, they're allowing the CCP to infiltrate the countryside and the cities. And eventually, the U.S. gets so frustrated with the lack of an agreement between these parties that they come up with this sort of hands-off policy. And they position themselves as being neutral. One, they're not actually 110% sure that the Soviets are backing the CCP, which is, in hindsight, mind-boggling. But they also don't have a whole lot of faith in Chiang Kai-shek, his armed forces, and his political goals. So they're willing to help to an extent, but they're also holding out hope that, like, hey, we'll be as neutral as possible, and hopefully these two can get things together. The face-off between the CCP and the KMT looks like it's about to touch off again, and there's also a number of political issues and shortcomings that are flaring up for Chiang and the KMT. One thing that Chiang does after the war is a lot of his guys, his down-home guys, the guys that he got through the war with, he puts them in positions of power throughout China, even if they're not from, let's say, northern China. So he'll take a general or warlord, whatever, from southern China and say, hey, you're going to be the governor up here. And he has no relation to the people up there, no connections, so he kind of handles himself in not the best way, enriches himself, and you've got resentment brewing on the ground because of this. In addition, they exchange or offer some new currency that the Chinese people are supposed to exchange their old currency for. And the rate of this new currency is basically 30-1. So you have a lot of people that have to exchange a lot of that old currency in order to get this new currency. And actually what I mean by this currency is this is the money that was used in occupied China. So the currency that was circulated amongst the Chinese living under Japanese control. It's pegged at 30-1. So the people that are outside of Japanese-held territory, they're exchanging, their purchasing power is absolutely massive. And the people that were in the occupied areas, they're exchanging 30 of the currency they had been using to get one of this KMT's currency. So this plays havoc on the local economies. And you have some people that went broke overnight and some people that benefited greatly because of this. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot to be critical of Chiang about.
And then also, there was a lot of misbehavior.
Yeah.
As troops moved through China, particularly in Shanghai or Beijing.
Yeah. There was a lot of raping and pillaging, allegedly. So there's resentment brewing because of that. Chiang shows up in Beijing a little bit later, and I think things go a little smoother. People are happy to see him. Realistically, at the end of the Second World War, he's a rock star, man. He just led China throughout all of this, but there's a lot of problems. He looks good right now, but his regime is not out of the woods.
Definitely not out of the woods. Perhaps because there's about to be a civil war.
Civil wars are brewing.
That's right.
In all of these negotiations that are taking place in 1946, they end up actually coming together for a ceasefire in January of 1946. The Russians are, by this point in time, firmly backing the CCP.
While the United States still kind of playing middleman.
Waffling in the middle, man. But despite this ceasefire, on January 18th, there's an assault on a place called Yingkou. Now, this is a CCP assault on this KMT-held city. And the American reports, for whatever reason, do not include this. And these reports are written by General George C. Marshall. Marshall, who I believe is the same Marshall of the Marshall Plan, which was the plan to rebuild Europe after the war, is sent to China to help sort of work through these negotiations and convince both of these sides that they have more to come together and work together on, and they don't need to be fighting. But he doesn't mention that the CCP violated the ceasefire and attacked Yingkou. But also, this is kind of confusing because there's also reports that the KMT violated the truce. So naturally, Marshall's probably somewhere in the middle, thinking, I don't know who started the shooting.
So it didn't happen.
Right. It's unclear who actually violated the truce. Jay Taylor seems to come down and say it was the CCP. But I'm sure there's some other historians that might think differently. I don't know enough about it to know either way. But the Soviets really kind of begin their full-scale withdrawal. And again, like we mentioned before, it's kind of delayed to the benefit of the CCP, basically allowed the CCP to fan out throughout Manchuria as they were leaving, and allowed them to collect any excess Japanese arms that they could while the Soviets were on their way out. And Marshall, being in charge of this mission from the U.S. to bring these two together, is like, I think this was a success.
I did a great job.
Yeah. I mean, he actually believes that he's negotiated a sort of ceasefire in the Chinese Civil War, but realistically, we are a short time away from the Civil War really picking up. As a matter of fact, the first battles of the Civil War take place in, the first significant battles, that is, take place in March of 1946. The KMT is run out of a city called Mukden. I believe we mentioned this in earlier episodes. This is one of those...
The Mukden incident.
Right. It's an important city in Manchuria that we talked about before. And then they are also run out of another important city in Manchuria called Changchun on April 14th. So initially, the KMT suffer some significant defeats.
Chang taking L's left and right.
Constantly, man. So now Manchuria was heavily dominated by the CCP, especially in the north. And now they're infiltrating and making their way to the south. And by this point, a month and a half, 2 months after Marshall had been like, success.
I did so good.
Now he's like, no, this is not going well. And I believe the KMT are to blame for these setbacks.
This was certainly not a failing of mine.
Yeah. I mean, the sad thing is like, Chiang can't seem to catch a break, man.
No.
Not to say that none of this is of his own doing.
Right.
Because obviously there were plenty of places where he could have played things differently. But my God, this is not good. So now Chiang, after surviving the Second World War and the onslaught that the Japanese put on him and the sometimes real bad relationship that he had with the United States, he's found himself in a full-blown civil war in a position where he's outmaneuvered and the CCP has the upper hand in the most important, strategically important part of China.
All right. That my friend, sounds like an excellent place to pause.
Yep.
We will return for the conclusion of the Life of Chiang Kai-shek, Part 6.
Oh, this is officially our longest cast.
It is, but you know what? We got Teddy Roosevelt on the docket.
Oh, man, he's going to double them up.
He might. He really might. But anyway, Melvin, before we go, we should remind everyone that they could support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star rating and review in iTunes, clicking the subscribe button. If you are not already subscribed to the podcast, what are you doing and how are you finding us? Additionally, please tell your friends about the Life of X podcast.
Tell the people they need this.
Melvin, if they'd like to support us in any other way, how could they do so?
So you can visit us at the lifeofxpodcast.com and click on our either Amazon if you're going to buy some stuff. You can become a patron by clicking on our Patreon link. And you can also, if you're really into audiobooks, click on our Audible link and you will be receiving a free book if you go through us. So, you know what? If you want to support the pod, best ways to do it, those 3 ways. Leave us reviews.
And we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.